it's time for The Clash. Always hotly debated, we tackle one of the big topics of the day from opposing points of view. Following a year and a half of unprecedented public spending, an erosion of civil liberties, and a tax burden on the British public, the highest it's been since the 1940s, is the Conservative Party still Conservative? To debate this, I'm delighted to welcome Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown, Conservative MP and Treasurer of the 1922 Committee of Tory backbenchers, Craig Dillon, founder of Westminster Digital and former advisor to Boris Johnson, Christopher Snowden from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and last but not least, former Conservative minister under Margaret Thatcher, writer and broadcaster, and double mastermind winner, I should know because she pipped me to the post on the last one, EDWINA Currie. Folks, welcome to the programme. Edwina, let me start with you. Are the Conservatives conservative anymore?
Well, we're not as conservative as I think some of our members and some of the commentators would like us to be, particularly when it comes to things like wearing face masks and so on, perhaps. But it's always been a pragmatic party. I mean, that's why it's still in existence 200 years on. It's always been a party that's adapted to circumstances. We borrow money when we have to. We tax if we possibly can. We do believe in sound money, but you can't do that overnight. And we do believe in getting the economy moving and naturally overall looking after people. And the fact that we're well ahead in the polls means that somewhere along the line, Boris is getting it right. I do accept that there are members of Parliament, particularly who have got the jitters. And I would say to them, you know, onward, upward, optimists. We're going to win the next election. You watch.
Edwina, was the Prime Minister right to invoke the memory of a woman that you served under, Margaret Thatcher, when he said Mrs Thatcher would effectively have raised taxes to pay for the pandemic?
As I recall, what he said was that she would be wagging her finger about it, which is not quite the same sort of thing. We will have to raise taxes sooner or later, and it's appropriate that we should do so. But at the moment, just remember this, interest rates are extremely low, extremely low. And it's one of the reasons why we've got a big housing boom going on, and because mortgages are so low. That cannot continue forever. And a prudent government, Gordon Brown's old word, a prudent government is going to be very sensible about raising taxes and trying to get the national debt back under control. And that, of course, means things like abandoning the £20 uplift for universal credit, despite all the racket. Furlough has come to an end, and national insurance rates are going to go up, all of which have been, I think, by and large accepted by the public as necessary steps forward.
So, Geoffrey Clifton Brown, thank you for dressing up for the show tonight.
Well, I'm on duty elsewhere, but I'm delighted to be with you.
I guessed as much. And Sir Geoffrey, thanks very much for making the time. You're clearly at an event, and we'd love to know what you think. Is your party still the Conservative Party?
At heart it is. But of course it's had two mammoth events. The one is Brexit and the second is the pandemic. The first, of course, was predictable. The second, it certainly wasn't. And it's had to take some actions that it would never normally have wanted to take. I'm sure if Boris were here on the show, he would say he never wanted to take away people's liberties in the way that it did. The Conservative Party is the party of freedom, of individual choice, and he never wanted to take people's livelihoods away in the way that he had and come up with furlough. So we've spent nearly 400 billion during the pandemic. We would never have expected to pay. And I think all this talk about the Conservative Party being the party of low taxation, of course it is, but it has to react, as Edwina, my old colleague and friend, says. We are the pragmatic party. We have to react to events. And we spent this 400 billion, but we've still got to fix the social care sector. I know, I'm on the Public Accounts Committee. The social care sector suffered hugely during the pandemic. And it is absolutely essential that we fix it. And it's absolutely essential that we raise the money to fix it, to look after some of our most elderly and most vulnerable people in society and some of the lowest people in society. So, of course, at its heart, it is still Conservative, but it's had to react to events. And now we need to, as Edwina says, pay off the debt, get the economy going again, get people back to work, and then we can get back to our Conservative roots of low taxation, of business, of the family, of freedom of choice, of people, this country being open, a really open society, the most open in the world. And that is where we will be when we've got back from all this problem with the pandemic.
Christopher Snowden from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Richard Tice, the leader of Reform UK, would beg to differ that the Tories are still Conservatives. And he's got his eye on those votes of people that would like to have a low-tax economy and a restoration of civil liberties.
Yes, I think in many respects the Conservative Party is becoming more conservative than it's been for quite a long time. I think it's going back to the post-war consensus between 1945 and 1979. The Conservative Party more or less went along with the idea that socialism was a good thing and it was rather popular, and the best way to deal with it was try and bring it in responsibly and stop the more extreme socialists from getting their way. And that led, over a period of decades, thanks to both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, with Margaret Thatcher being left in a real mess in 1979. And Margaret Thatcher wasn't really a conservative. She had conservative social views, but she was a classical liberal, really. And she had the virtue of economic literacy. And for someone like me, who is not a conservative, that was probably the best period in the 80s and 90s. To some extent, David Cameron and George Osborne took that on a little bit, insofar as there was a bit of an attempt to try and balance books. But under Theresa May and Boris Johnson, I think they've reverted to the more old school form of conservatism, in which you just kind of muddle along. You don't worry too much about building up debt. You leave that 5-10 years in the future. And that, I think, will have the same effect as it did in the 60s and 70s. It will leave somebody eventually with a huge problem to solve, and it will take somebody who's prepared to take big decisions, looking to the future with a view to the reality of economics. So I'm not sure what side of the clash I'm supposed to be on here. I would actually say the Conservatives, if you look at it historically, are in fact probably more conservative than they've been in my lifetime.
Now, Craig Dillon, founder of Westminster Digital, former advisor to Boris Johnson. There you've got a historic overview from Christopher Snowden, suggesting that this Tory party has reverted to type. It's back in the hands of the economic wets, the wets that Margaret Thatcher so famously despised.
Yeah, and I think, I don't necessarily think they're doing a particularly bad thing. I'm over in the US, and if you look in comparison, for example, the Democrats over here are basically following the same path as the Labour Party, becoming very, very left-wing. But in comparison, the Republicans are staying very right-wing. They're not embracing the centre ground, as we've seen Boris do. And what we're seeing in the UK is, it's pretty much a one-party state now. The Labour Party are nowhere near the Conservatives. So I think they're doing exactly what they need to do, picking up votes from all sides of the party and really showing people that they are the natural party of government. And I think it's working fantastically well, as we saw this weekend. It worked, the conference did very well. Everyone seems to be on Team Boris.
However, Edwina, you mentioned that the public are quite happy, and you're absolutely right to draw attention to the Prime Minister's success in the polls and that of the government. But that's because the bill for the pandemic hasn't come in yet.
Oh, yes, that's true, but only to an extent. I mean, we can see exactly how much, as Geoffrey said, how much has been spent so far. And we're well aware that there are more bills to come. For example, the NHS, in order to catch up with the backlog, which is very serious, is going to have to spend quite a lot more money over the next 18 months or 2 years. So that's also being allowed for in the increase in national insurance. But Christopher is quite right. There is one thing that I think modern Tories have learned from the Labour Party, and that is not to, I was going to say, be too principled. I don't mean that. I mean, not to put principle before practical politics. In the end, what governments are elected to do is look after the welfare of the people, all of the people, if at all possible, and certainly to look to the future and to see how we can benefit and the growth of the economy. Some of the increase in revenue, which is not the same as tax rates, but some of the increase in revenue will come from the growth of the economy. So much of what's going on, particularly up here in the north of England, there's very heated discussion about exactly how it's going to happen. It will come from investment in infrastructure and in education up here to kind of bring us up to some of the standards that you take for granted down south. That will help to grow the economy and to see higher productivity. And that feeds through into better standards of living, higher wages and so on, and means that we can cope with whatever little bits of inflation are floating around. Some of your previous discussion referred to some of that. I'm quite optimistic. I think it's going to work. I think we've got a very good chance of actually making all this work and coming out of it looking much stronger and in a better state than we are at the moment.
However, Sir Geoffrey, the Prime Minister is borrowing and spending a lot of money. We have, of course, a budget deficit, which means that more is going out than comes in. We'll have that for the foreseeable future. National debt is over £2 trillion. Edwina mentioned inflation, which is on the rise. It could be 4 or 5% by Christmas. Rising living costs, energy costs as well. And the national debt that's, only heading north. It sounds really like a Labour government.
Well, as I said earlier, you can't spend £400 billion on the pandemic out of nowhere. And thank goodness, actually, under the Conservative stewardship, the economy was strong enough to enable us to be able to borrow this huge amount of money. Now, we've got a budget coming up on the 27th of October, where the Chancellor will set out our fiscal and economic position. And I am sure that he's going to have a plan as to how this money is going to be paid back, because we need to start to pay it back, because if we hit another crisis like this pandemic, then we will be in real trouble. And we need to maintain the confidence of the international markets. So I think, yes, the Conservatives, I think that's the one difference, I think, really, as has been said by Edwina and others, between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. We are fiscally responsible. We've always had to clear up the problems that have been left by the previous Labour government. And we are determined that this economy, as Edwina has said, will go ahead. I mean, what a thing to have an economy where there are 1 million vacancies. All of the previous prime ministers, mostly all of them, including Margaret Thatcher, would have loved to have been in a position where they had 1 million job vacancies. They were wrestling with huge problems of unemployment. At least somebody now, if they're able to, is able to go and get a job. And that is a huge turnaround compared to where we were in the 80s and 90s. So I'm optimistic for this economy. And I do think this present Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has got his absolute fingers on the economy and will come up with a plan on the 27th of October as to how we're going to deal with it.
Well, Sir Geoffrey, you and Edwina have pitched for the idea that the Conservatives are economically essentially pragmatic and that they always have been. This is a crisis that was unforeseen. What about the fundamental values and philosophies of the Conservative Party, particularly individual responsibility? This is a Conservative government that's imprisoned people in their own homes on and off for 1.5 years, and which continues to threaten medical apartheid with vaccine passports. Again, not very Conservative ideas.
So I've been a member of Parliament for almost 30...
I'll come to you shortly, Sir Geoffrey.
I've been a member of Parliament for 30 years. I've only voted against my government before the pandemic 3 times, since and during the pandemic, on for precisely the issues you've said, because I am a freedom-loving Conservative. I think the idea of taking away people's liberties, except in the most extreme circumstances, and there were times in the pandemic where it was extreme, but I think the timing of a lot of it was unnecessary. As you say, I'm opposed to renewal of the emergency powers. I'm opposed to vaccine passports. On the whole, we should trust people to make their own sensible decisions and go about and get their normal life back as soon as possible.
Edwina, vaccine passports, an unconservative idea, anathema to somebody like Margaret Thatcher.
Well, Margaret didn't have to cope with an enormous pandemic, a tragedy that has murdered millions of people worldwide. It's been absolutely dreadful, and it's not over yet. And in fact, Margaret, as a scientist, I'm sure, would have evaluated the various options and probably done exactly the same. And given her slight instinct for telling people what to do, I bet it would have gone on for a lot longer. What the government did, as far as England was concerned, back in July, was just say, that's it. There are no more rules. You know, the other nations in the UK didn't take that view. There are no more rules, and we do trust you. And the scientists and the experts were saying, this is not going to work. This is going to end up with many thousands and more people in hospital. We do have people in hospital, but they're nearly all not vaccinated. So one of the useful things that you could do, Mark, and that GBNews could do, would be to encourage everybody, get their vaccinations and get their boosters, not least because that's the way that personal responsibility is exercised, not only to protect yourself, but to protect everyone that's around you that you love and everybody that you care about, and even those you don't care about that you're sitting next to on the bus or whatever. When it comes to vaccine passports, I was very happy to use mine when I was traveling recently, when I went on holiday. It seemed to me just a practical solution to the question of putting a load of people in a aluminium tube and sending them for 4 hours all together into the atmosphere, and making sure that people didn't actually get sick as a result. I think that's a practical matter again. I don't see it as a matter of principle. What I do see as a matter of principle, actually, is insisting that people who work in care homes should be vaccinated, and that there it's not a matter of individual responsibility. If you're looking after some of the most vulnerable people in our society, people for whom actually we all feel responsible, then I think you have a duty to get vaccinated. And if you refuse, then I think you should go and do some different job. There, I think the government is absolutely right to dig its heels in and to say, sorry, there are plenty of other jobs, go and do something else. The environment that you're working in requires you to be as safe as possible.
Craig Dillon, I would argue that a naturally conservative response to the pandemic would be what happened in Sweden or Florida or Texas.
Yeah, it's been very, very different over here. And it's been very interesting comparing the two countries and actually being outside of the UK and sort of looking in and watching all of the things that was going on. You know, I had spent a lot of time sort of boasting to my friends how free we were over here while you guys were in masks and lockdowns. And now, of course, it's come back. We're all, especially in DC, it's a vaccine passport everywhere. You can't get into a bar, you can't get a restaurant without a vaccine passport. So, you know, there's differences, but as you say, if I go down to Florida, they don't care. So I think, you know, there's ways to balance this up. I think the Conservatives in the UK have done a good job of it. I think it was a little bit strict in the summer, but now hopefully things are under control and they're going to keep it that way. But I always say that I would much rather that it was Boris Johnson running these things than, you know, Keir or even worse, Jeremy Corbyn. So I think, you know, we have the best leader at doing that.
Craig, you mentioned Sir Keir Starmer. Shouldn't that be a concern, Christopher Snowden, to the Prime Minister, that Keir Starmer has supported most of his COVID measures for the last year and a half? Some of my viewers feel, Christopher, that we've had a year and a half of communism.
Yeah, but if you look at the polls, all these measures have been pretty popular, and the one guiding principle of the Conservative Party is to find the middle ground. They're very good at finding the middle ground and doing popular things. You might recall that Nigel Farage, about a year ago, was thinking about turning his campaigning machine towards opposing lockdown, but very quickly he looked at the opinion polls and decided this was not really a vote winner at all. Whatever you feel about lockdown, the reality is that the vast majority of people supported it. I don't think they support it now, actually, and I think, again, Boris is following the median voter on these things. But on the broader personal liberty argument, I've talked about economics, but on the personal liberty things, yes, the Conservatives traditionally, I would say, have been more in favour of personal liberty than the Labour Party, for example. But I think that is one area where the Conservative Party is less conservative in that sense than they used to be. So if you look at the nanny state measures, they're more nanny state than Tony Blair. Conservatives used to go on about Tony Blair being a nanny state. It's the Conservatives who brought in plain packaging for tobacco, a sugar tax, banning plastic straws, banning all sorts of different things. How popular that is, I'm not quite sure. I don't really know why they do it. I guess there's not much electoral backlash from doing so. But on that score, I would say yes. I think quite needlessly, really, they've decided to become anti-liberty when it comes to some of these personal issues.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Perhaps, Sir Geoffrey, the issue is that Boris Johnson himself is no conservative, no libertarian.
I'm sure that's not the case. I think at heart he is absolutely a libertarian. And I think the last thing he wanted to do...
What's the point of being a libertarian at heart? I mean, why have values if you don't lead by them?
Well, let me just finish what I was about to say. If we go back to the 23rd of March 2020, when he announced the lockdown, he was criticised for doing it far too late because the last thing he wanted to do was to take people's liberty away and lock them down. But he took the tough decisions. And it was a Conservative government that found Kate Bingham, that introduced the vaccines, found somebody to make them, made the NHS deliver them all in 10 months when it normally takes 10 years. And that is what is now given us our life back to normal. So I think we can probably all agree that actually the path out of the pandemic has been, brought about by this Conservative government.
Craig Dillon, props to the Prime Minister on a personal level, and I've said it more than once on this programme, for making Freedom Day happen on the 19th of July. The opposition said it was reckless, while he was vindicated with that move because cases fell and the economy and society got back on a path to recovery.
Yeah, and it's another thing of being here that I've thoroughly enjoyed is watching how the media and especially Twitter over there can blame everything in England on Brexit and these things. Literally we have shortages in the supermarkets in America right now, and I'm waiting for them to come on and say, well, this is due to Brexit. They seem to be able to plaster everything as being down to Brexit. There was the fuel crisis, one of these things, but none of these things seem to have had a problem. It's the same here. They can't get lorry drivers. There's a delay in the supply chains. It's happening across the world, but it's just in England that they seem to think everything comes down to Brexit. It was the beginning of the world. So I think, he did it. He finally got us out. It needed to be done. It was difficult at the start, but we're through that now, and I think we're on a much better path, and I think everything's going to be fine.
And very briefly, from all four of you, your reaction to the Prime Minister's speech to conference on Wednesday, starting with you, Craig. You're a former advisor to Boris Johnson. What did you make of the speech? Was it vintage Johnson?
It was, and Build Back Beaver has gone down a storm over here because obviously Biden says Build Back Better a lot. So that is, wonderful. It trended all over Twitter. So I thought, great job to that team.
Quick word on the speech. Christopher, your thoughts about the Prime Minister's speech?
Yeah, sorry. I thought it was very entertaining. I thought it was one of the funniest speeches I've ever seen a politician give. But he ignored all the elephants in the room. He ignored all the problems that the country faces at the moment. And I don't just mean long term. I mean over this winter. We could really have a winter of discontent. And I don't think we're going to get through it with blind optimism. And, of course, this is one of the charges levelled at Boris, that he's very, very humorous. But there's not a lot of weight to it. I hope that Rishi, who I do genuinely think kind of understands the economics of this and is concerned about the way things are going, people like Rishi, I hope, will give him some policies with which to back up the rhetoric.
EDWINA CURRIE, you were an effective, high-profile and assiduous minister, one of the best-known politicians of your generation, and you served under one of the great iconic prime ministers of the 20th century, Margaret Thatcher. What's your view of Boris Johnson? Do you rate him? Has he got the chops to get us through this crisis?
I think on the basis of this week and the speech this week, it's looking good. He's certainly started off with far more problems, than Margaret had. But she started off terribly hesitant, and she really didn't make any impact until the Falklands War. Boris, on the other hand, has absolutely taken the Tory party by storm. And however much carping there might be, and I don't think there is that much, you don't hear it on the doorsteps. What you get on the doorstep is ordinary working people saying, oh, I like Boris, I like Boris. He is very good indeed at picking up the vibes, actually working almost slightly ahead of the vibe of how people feel, what they want to do, and how they want to do it. He's a very, very clever man. Do not underestimate him.
Sir Geoffrey, do you echo that sentiment about the Prime Minister? Were you in the hall on Wednesday?
I was. Absolutely I was. And I think, but the reaction in the hall isn't really what's important. It's the reaction out there that's important. There was a lot of optimism. There are a lot of hooks on which to catch his future policy. It's now up to his... And I think what he has in spades as a character, he is able to take the difficult decisions. Just look at the one I've just referred to, taking away people's liberties in a way that hasn't happened since the Second World War. When it comes to dealing with the difficult problems, somehow Boris always manages to pull a rabbit out of a hat. And I think, as others have said, we've got a very good Chancellor, we've got a very good Education Secretary, we've now got a very good Health Secretary, we've got a good Home Secretary, we've got people in the team who can actually deliver on the individual problems of the country. And I think the country will now get out of the pandemic and begin to recover quite sharply.
While we have you, Sir Geoffrey, and thanks very much for including us in what is clearly a busy evening for you, terribly sad news about the death of James Brokenshire, Conservative MP, former Cabinet Minister, tragically passed away at the age of 53. Leading the tributes, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said he was desperately sad to hear the news of Mr Brokenshire's passing, described him as the nicest, kindest and most unassuming of politicians, but also extraordinarily effective. He was the MP for Old Bexley and Sidcup. He announced in August that his lung cancer had progressed and that he would be beginning a new line of treatment. He lost his life today. Did you know him well?
I did. And this is entirely coincidental, but it actually echoes a lot of what you've just paid tribute to him. Literally minutes before I came on this programme, I put on our WhatsApp, in answer to Ian Duncan Smith's tribute to him, I put, Ian, I entirely agree. He was a lovely, gentle, but intelligent and effective colleague. And I think he was exactly that. He was a politician who had got qualities that if we had more of those, the country would be a kinder and a gentler place.
A terrible, terrible loss to his family and to public life. In memory of James Brokenshire. My sincere thanks to Edwina Currie, former Conservative Health Minister, Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown, Conservative MP and Treasurer of the 1922 Committee, Craig Dillon, former advisor to Boris Johnson, founder of Westminster Digital, and Christopher Snowden, head of lifestyle economics at the IEA. Many thanks to one and all.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.